Welcome to part 2 of our Bible study on Matthew 24. We will be discussing verses 1 through 35, which pertain to the destruction of Jerusalem, which took place in 70 AD at the hands of the Romans. To understand this text, we must keep the context in mind, especially what Jesus had said in chapter 23 and verse 38. See, your house is left to you desolate. The house Jesus refers to is the temple in Jerusalem, as we will now see. This statement by Jesus prompts questions from his apostles in chapter 24 and verses 1 through 3. Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said to them, Do you not see all these things? Assuredly, I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down. Now, as he sat on the Mount of Olives, his disciples came to him privately, saying, Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Jesus understood what they meant by their questions, and he chose to answer such first. When will these things take place? First, Jesus tells them of several signs that would indicate that the temple was near its destruction. The first of these signs would be that there would be those who claim to be him, the Messiah. Of course, Jesus instructs them, do not believe it, in verse 23, even warning them, see, I have told you beforehand, in verse 25. The second of these signs would be wars and rumors of wars, as he stated in verse 6 and verse 7. Civil unrest was an experience that marked that time period for the Jewish nation. Josephus records the Emperor Caligula sending armies from Rome to have his statue erected in the temple itself. In Wars of the Jews, he says, accordingly, he sent Petronius with an army to Jerusalem to place his statues in the temple, and commanded him that in case the Jews would not admit of them, he should slay those that opposed it, and carry all the rest of the nation into captivity. Now, as to the Jews, some of them could not believe the stories that spoke of a war, but those that did believe them were in the utmost distress how to defend themselves. And the terror diffused itself presently through them all, for the army was already come to Ptolemais. Caligula died prior to giving the order to Petronius to slaughter the Jews. Many other instances of civil unrest arose over the years, which culminated in a full-scale revolt of the Jews against Rome in 66 AD, leading to a declaration of war from Rome. The third of these signs would be in the form of famines, earthquakes, and pestilences spoken of in chapter 24 and verse 7. As far as famines, a prophet named Agabus prophesied about such a famine in Acts 11 and verse 28. Then one of them, named Agabus, stood up and showed by the Spirit that there was going to be a great famine throughout all the world, which also happened in the days of Claudius Caesar. The year of this prophecy would be about the year 46 AD. Josephus records this famine as occurring during the reign of Claudius Caesar in his Antiquities of the Jews. Now her coming was of very great advantage to the people of Jerusalem, for whereas a famine did oppress them at that time, and many people died for want of what was necessary to procure food withal, Queen Helena sent some of her servants to Alexandria with money to buy a great quantity of corn, and others of them to Cyprus to bring cargo of dried figs. This famine occurred in the year 47 AD, a short time after Agabus had predicted as such. The historian Suetonius records in his Life of Claudius there was a scarcity of food, which was the result of bad harvests that occurred during a span of several years. As far as earthquakes, several historians record them at the time. Tacitus, in his Annals, records the occurrences of earthquakes in Rome, Laodicea, Colossae, and Hierapolis, all during the reign of Nero, who was emperor from 64 to 68 AD. Historian Philostratus records earthquakes during the 40s AD in Chios, Miletus, Samos, and Smyrna. Even Josephus, in his Wars of the Jews, says, For there broke out a prodigious storm in the night, with the utmost violence and very strong winds, with the largest showers of rain, with continual lightnings, terrible thunderings, and amazing concussions and bellowings of the earth that was in an earthquake. The text goes on with an encouragement from Jesus not to lose heart. He warns them of several things. He warns them of persecutions to come in chapter 24 and verse 9. He warns them about false prophets in verse 10 and verse 11. Then he makes this statement in verse 14, which has proven problematic for some. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come. This does not have to mean the entire globe, which it does not mean. The very language would be used later by the Apostle Paul. Notice in the Colossian letter how Paul describes the spread of the gospel in chapter 1 of Colossians in verse 5 and verse 6. Because of the hope which is laid up for you in heaven, of which you heard before in the word of the truth of the gospel, which has come to you, as it has also in all the world, and is bringing forth fruit, as it is also among you, since the day you heard and knew the grace of God in truth. Then he says in verse 23 about the gospel, which was preached to every creature under heaven. Notice that Paul is stating what had been done, not that which was to be done. All the world here, what appears to be intended by this language, is the Roman world rather than the entire earth. And this makes sense in the context. Jesus also appeals to Old Testament prophecy in his teaching about when these things would be to the apostles. Verse 15 says, Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. So we see this abomination of desolation idea being brought up. This is a direct reference to Daniel chapter 9, verse 24 through 27. We will not enter into an exposition of this text from Daniel here, but we can notice some very important things. Verse 24 makes the time period referred to by Daniel fairly clear. Notice that what will be accomplished will be to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up the vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. All these things are mentioned in chapter 7 of Daniel in verse 24. Now, these are all descriptive of the work that Jesus did on the cross. The abomination that makes desolate was the end of Daniel's 77th prophecy. Remember that Jesus had said, See, your house is left to you desolate. When Jesus the Messiah finished his work on the cross, the need for animal sacrifices offered at the temple in Jerusalem was no more. It was no longer needed. Also notice the transition and how the temple is referred to by Jesus. We go back to Matthew chapter 21 and verse 13. When he cleanses the temple, he refers to it as my house. Whereas in Matthew 23 and verse 38, which is part of our text, he refers to it as your house. It can be concluded from this that God had departed from the temple. Daniel chapter 9 and verse 26 goes on to say, And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. The prince is the Roman general Titus, who was also the son of the emperor Vespasian. He is the one who led the troops who destroyed Jerusalem. Daniel chapter 9 and verse 27 is somewhat peculiar, saying, And on the wing of abominations shall be one who makes desolate. It's interesting that the Septuagint version of the Old Testament, which was translated in the 2nd century BC, reads, And on the temple shall be the abomination of desolations. We also note that Jesus instructs his followers in these verses. He says in verse 16, Those in Judea flee to the mountains. He means the coming destruction will be swift and serious. Do not waste time hanging around Jerusalem. Eusebius in his ecclesiastical history says the people of the Jerusalem church were commanded by an oracle given by revelation before the war to those in the city who were worthy of it to depart and dwell in one of the cities of Perea, which they called Pella. He warns them not to believe reports of those having seen him, also not to listen to false prophets. Josephus in Wars of the Jews says a false prophet was the occasion of these people's destruction, who had made a public proclamation in the city that very day that God commanded them to get up upon the temple, and that there they should receive miraculous signs of their deliverance. Now, there was then a great number of false prophets, suborned by the tyrants to impose upon the people, who denounced this to them, that they should wait for deliverance from God, and this was in order to keep them from deserting, that they might be buoyed up above fear and care by such hopes. Jesus tells them that the judgment that is coming on Jerusalem will be quick and obvious. It will be something unmistakable, like lightning striking from the east to the west, that he describes in chapter 24, verse 27. This reinforces what he had already told them regarding their fleeing. He also tells them that the army will gather around the corpse in verse 28. Vultures is also the same Greek word that is translated as eagle. An eagle was the symbol of the Roman army. And what Jesus intends by this imagery is that the Jewish system was dead as a corpse, and the eagles, or vultures, the Roman army, would gather around it to devour it. Jesus next describes what appears to be some type of cosmic cataclysm. Some would have seen the second coming in verses 29 through 31. However, a parallel passage in Mark chapter 13 and verse 24 says, in those days, after that tribulation. We must understand that Jesus is using something called prophetic hyperbole, which was commonly used in the Old Testament to describe impending doom on a nation. Consider these verses. In Isaiah chapter 13 and verse 10, describing the judgment on Babylon, the text reads, for the stars of heaven and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be darkened in its going forth, and the moon will not cause its light to shine. In verse 13, it says, therefore I will shake the heavens, and the earth will move out of their place, in the wrath of the Lord of hosts, and in the day of his fierce anger. This doesn't mean that these things literally happen. We don't see the moon not causing its light to shine and things such as that, or the sun being darkened. It's just descriptive of judgment. Also in Edom, judgment on Edom described in Isaiah 34 and verse 4 and 5, the text says, all the host of heaven shall be dissolved, and the heavens shall be rolled up like a scroll. All their hosts shall fall down as the leaf falls from the vine, and as the fruit falling from a fig tree. For my sword shall be bathed in heaven. Indeed, it shall come down on Edom and on the people of my curse for judgment. Notice that there were no heavens being rolled up like a scroll literally. It's just the language of judgment. We also see judgment on Egypt recorded in Ezekiel 32 and verse 7 and 8, where it says, when I put out your light, I will cover the heavens and make its stars dark. I will cover the sun with a cloud, and the moon shall not give its light. All the bright lights of the heavens I will make dark over you, and bring darkness upon your land, says the Lord God. Lastly, let's consider the description given in Joel chapter 2 and verse 31, where it says, the sun shall be turned into darkness, and the moon into blood, before the coming of the great and awesome day of the Lord. Understand that in Acts chapter 2 and verse 20, this verse is quoted by the Apostle Peter, who says about the events that day on Pentecost, this is that which was spoken by the prophet Joel. And he repeats this quote from Joel chapter 2 and verse 31. No literal darkness, nor bloody moon, just God trying to get their attention with inflated language. This type of language is God's way of saying your world is about to come crashing down on you. Jesus then tells of the sign of the Son of Man in verse 30. Many read this and come away as seeing the sign as being in heaven, which is not necessary at all. The sign was Jerusalem's destruction as a fulfillment of prophecy. The sign was not in heaven. In heaven actually describes the location of the Son of Man, the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. Jesus describes the mourning of the tribes of the earth in chapter 24 and verse 30. We must be aware that the Greek word translated here as earth can also be translated as land. If it were translated that way, mourning of the tribes of the land, the Jewish nation or tribes, would be the ones mourning over Jerusalem's destruction, which would much more easily fit the context as well. Jesus speaks of the Son of Man on the clouds as well in verse 30, which does sound like language of the end times. We must, however, be aware that the Old Testament prophets use this language when speaking of judgment. Notice Isaiah chapter 19 and verse 1 says, behold, the Lord rides on a swift cloud and will come into Egypt. The idols of Egypt will totter at his presence, and the heart of Egypt will melt in its midst. Also, Jeremiah chapter 4 and verse 13 says, Behold, he shall come up like clouds, and this chariot like a whirlwind. His horses are swifter than eagles. Woe to us, for we are plundered. Certainly, Egypt or Jerusalem saw God literally riding clouds as they were undergoing punishment, which means it would not be necessary here either. Jesus uses more strange language in verse 31, where he speaks of the gathering of the elect, saying, And he will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. The Greek word here that is translated as angels can just as readily be translated as messengers. With this in mind, would we automatically think of the second coming if it were translated, and he will send his messengers with a great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other? This is simply describing the gospel message going forth. Jesus then speaks of the certainty of the signs he has just described in verse 33. He said that they know that summer is near by the leaves on a fig tree. The leaves were signs of summer's approach. He follows this example with, So you also, when you see all these things, know that it is near at the doors. Now notice who is to see these signs. The ones he spoke to. Read verse 34. There the text says, Assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. There are a couple of ways to see this. Either these things have happened because all those Jesus spoke to in Matthew 24 have died, or there are some who are still alive that heard Jesus say these words when he originally spoke them. One of these is plausible, and the other is not. All these things that Jesus spoke about were to let them know that Jerusalem's destruction was near. We thank you for watching this video presented by the 11E Church of Christ, which meets in Jonesboro, Tennessee. We would love for you to join us for worship services. Our meeting times are Sunday at 10 o'clock for Bible class, and 11 o'clock and 3 p.m. for worship, and Wednesday at 7 o'clock p.m. for Bible study. Please email or regular mail any questions or comments to us that you have. If you have time, call our Dial a Bible Study number at 423-467-5200. Thanks for watching.